I just want to thank Ziba for singing that song earlier. Thank you for providing the audio. So Dr. Bashir Lahi asked me to read this passage tonight and provide some brief context to its message. This passage comes from, that I'm about to read, comes from Shoghi Effendi, who wrote it on July 28th, 1954. Shoghi Effendi, for those that don't know, led the Baha'i faith from 1921 until his passing in 1957. And though over 60 years have passed since its writing, I'm confident you'll find the message as relevant today as if it was written this very morning. Seeing as Shoghi Effendi is not here to provide additional clarification to his writings, I'll first read another passage that brings additional context to the Baha'i teachings so that we have some clarity going into it. This first passage comes from The Promised Day Has Come, and Shoghi Effendi writes, "The chief idols in the desecrated temple of mankind are none other than the triple gods of nationalism, racialism, and communism, at whose altars governments and peoples, whether democratic or totalitarian, at peace or at war, of the East or of the West, Christian or Islamic, are in various forms and in different degrees now worshiping." And this next passage comes from the Citadel of Faith, and I will actually, for those that are more visual learners, in the chat right now, I'll put the full passage so you can follow along. And here's a link to the document, which you can actually go and read the entirety of the writings. This is a collection of all of several of Shoghi Effendi's writings during a critical time period from the 40s to the 50s. Shoghi Effendi writes, "Moreover, the country of which it forms a part is passing through a crisis which, in its spiritual, moral, social, and political aspects, is of extreme seriousness, a seriousness which to a superficial observer is liable to be dangerously underestimated. The steady and alarming deterioration in the standard of morality is exemplified by the appalling increase of crime, by political corruption in ever widening and ever higher circles, by the loosening of the sacred ties of marriage, by the inordinate craving for pleasure and diversion, and by the marked and progressive slackening of parental control, is no doubt the most arresting and distressing aspect of the decline that has set in and can be clearly perceived in the fortunes of the entire nation. Parallel with this, and pervading all departments of life, an evil which the nation, and indeed all those within the capitalist system, though to a lesser degree, share with that state and its satellites regarded as the sworn enemies of that system, is the crass materialism, which lays excessive and ever-increasing emphasis on material well-being, forgetful of those things of the spirit on which alone a sure and stable foundation can be laid for human society. It is this same cancerous materialism, born originally in Europe, carried to excess in the North American continent, contaminating the Asiatic peoples and nations, spreading its ominous tentacles to the borders of Africa, and now invading its very heart, which Baha'u'llah in unequivocal and emphatic language denounced in his writings, comparing it to a devouring flame and regarding it as the chief factor in precipitating the dire ordeals and world-shaking crisis that must necessarily involve the burning of cities and the spread of terror and consternation in the hearts of men. Indeed, a foretaste of the devastation which this consuming fire will wreak upon the world, and with which it will lay waste the cities of the nations participating in this tragic world-engulfing contest, has been afforded by the last World War, marking the second stage in the global havoc which humanity, forgetful of its God and heedless of the clear warnings uttered by his appointed messenger for this day, must, alas, inevitably experience. It is this same all-pervasive, pernicious materialism against which the voice of the center of Baha'u'llah's covenant was raised, with pathetic persistence, from platform and pulpit, in his addresses to the heedless multitudes which, on the morrow of his fateful visit to both Europe and America, found themselves suddenly swept into the vortex of a tempest, which in its range and severity was unsurpassed in the world's history.
Thank you, Alex. Albors?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm getting nods, thumbs up. Okay. As I introduce our speaker tonight, I need to begin, as always, with an introduction of the faith, because for those who are not familiar with what's about to happen, it might seem like we're going to have a physician come and give a sermon. That may or may not be entirely accurate, but if you know anything about the Baha'i faith, and if you don't, I'll explain it right here. We as a religious group do not have priests. We don't have seminaries. And although, much like all of the other religions of this world, we try and propagate the voices of those who demonstrate expertise, we have to go about it a little bit differently, by the very nature of the fact that we're not training anyone to be an expert. We're all expected to be experts. On the physician topic, it's pretty interesting. The manifestations of God, the prophets, the messengers, are described as physicians within their own right? It's said within the Holy Writings that the all-knowing physician hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceiveth the disease and prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. And that every age has its own problems and every soul its own particular aspiration. The remedy of the world needeth in this present day can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Similarly, within my own talks, as we speak on topics of racial justice, I've multiple times made mention of the fact that justice is seeing with your own eyes and knowing with your own knowledge. It may be a coincidence then that we have a physician who particularly specializes in issues involving the eyes coming to speak to us. It may be a coincidence. It may be destiny, but it is absolutely my honor to introduce Dr. Nima Moanie, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, who is a practicing ophthalmologist for 10 years, currently in private practice, a legend in the area. With that, I yield the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me all right? Everybody can hear?
Yes, everybody can.
We're good. Good. Well, thank you so much for having me. Shall I go ahead and begin? Is there anyone else that wants to?
Yes. Please go on. Okay.
So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm an ophthalmologist by training, and the topic tonight is health and race. And one thing I learned when I was researching this topic was I am not really qualified to go into the details of the social aspects and the psychological aspects of racism in as it pertains to healthcare in a lot of ways. I come at it from a scientific side. My expertise is obviously science. Given that, my approach to this, and I hope that you guys feel free to ask questions, make it an open dialogue, and go from there. But I'm going to kind of approach it from a physician looking at a problem. And so what do we do? As a physician, we look at kind of what is the problem, what is the cause, how big or how pervasive is the issue, and then what is the treatment, if a treatment is required. And sometimes no treatment is required. Sometimes time is all that's required. So let's look at the problem and kind of approach it, see where racism, ethnicity, how it permeates in health, and what are the problems that arise. Let's look at what we can do after we've identified the problems that come up with it, and what are maybe some treatment options that we can do as far as getting through this. Now, this is a heavy topic, obviously. I'm going to try to, keep it interesting, keep it thing. But in the end of the day, this is a difficult topic. It's the more I looked into it, it is a relatively clear problem, but the solutions can be difficult. And so we'll kind of get into that a little bit. So first of all, what are we talking about here? Where's the problem? So one of the things that we're looking at here is let's take for an example, when I look at a patient that is, for example, somebody with a liver problem. When I look at somebody with a liver problem that comes into my practice, I'm an ophthalmologist, I'm preparing them for surgery, but they tell me they have some issues with the liver. The way a doctor approaches that is you have something called a differential diagnosis, meaning you have a bunch of different problems that you go through and systematically look at if there's any of these conditions, starting from the most important and going down, right? So I look and say, okay, this patient is, say, a younger patient. That automatically narrows it down a little bit. Am I thinking of is there alcohol? How long has the patient been exposed to, say, for example, some sort of toxicity or something like this, including alcohol? If they're very young, they can't obviously alcoholism in that level affecting the livers later. You think about hepatitis, you think about familial things like this, right? Those are based off of certain programmed knowledge that comes in, but also based off of looking at what I see. So one of the things that I looked at is when I do eye surgery, for example, one of the most common eye surgeries that all eye doctors do is cataract surgery. When you finish cataract surgery, about a month out, you look at see what their vision is. Their vision was something before. Say their vision was 20/60, which says about 30% degradation in vision. And then you look at what is their vision after surgery. Are they 20/20, which is 100%. 20/20 means that they're seeing what the normal eye should see at 20 feet, they're seeing at 20 feet. So they're seeing perfectly well. Now, for your goal usually in cataract surgery is to be 20/20. Sometimes that doesn't exactly happen, right? Sometimes they don't get into 20/20. Sometimes they're 20/40 after a month. And then you have to see why. Why did the surgery not yield a perfect result? Did the patient have something to begin with? Did they have some problems to begin with? Did they have macular degeneration? Did they have diabetes that caused the eye, stuff like this? I looked at my own data because one of the things we're going to talk about today is something called implicit bias, and along with things that can kind of permeate into a form of racial biases or racism that we don't intend to do. And I'm going to argue that not only is it permeating, it's permeating in all of us. And as an example of that, looking at my own data, and again, I'm going to tell you this is a little bit serious of a subject, but we're going to go through it together. If anyone gets uncomfortable, wants to say it, please. But for my own data, when I was looking at my data, I took 100 patients that I had, the last 100 patients that I had, that I knew the ethnicity of. African American and Caucasian. When I have a patient that's close to 20/20, almost perfect, some of the times if I'm just a little bit uncomfortable, I do an ultrasound of the back of the eye. It's called an OCT. And what that does is that shows minor imperfections in the back of the retina, in the macula, to see if there's anything else I could tweak a little bit more. You don't really need to do it if the patient is close to 20/20, but sometimes I do it just to be extra sure. What I noticed in my own data was that I was about 2 times more likely to do the OCT for a Caucasian patient than I was for an African patient. It shocked me, really. I thought there'd be no difference. In fact, in my practice, I purposely tell my staff that they're not allowed to put the insurance on my when the patient comes in, they have a ticket, so I know who I'm seeing and what their conditions and stuff like that are. I tell them I don't want to see it, so it doesn't bias me in my care. So in case they're a Medicaid patient, something like that, I don't come in with with some kind of bias. However, crept into my treatment, I was showing a preferential bias for the Caucasian patient just by looking at the numbers. Now, the causes of that could be multifactorial. There definitely is more comorbidities in my African patients on average, but that still doesn't excuse the fact that if I do the surgery, they should be seeing 20/20. You should expect to do the same tests for the same people given the same condition. So why is it that happened even in someone that is, I thought, like myself, that was relatively, well versed in this problem and all that. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit. So starting with this is to understand, how health kind of plays a role and how race plays a role, is we have to understand the concept of systemic racism is a big part, and also termed institutional racism. So just giving a definition of systemic racism is, quote, the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. And it was actually coined by a lawyer and then a judge, Sir William McPherson, in a trial in 1993. And this is going to sound eerily similar to things that are happening currently in our social climate here in the US. There was a young man in London who was killed in 1993 by 5 whites. And after that situation occurred, there were a number of witnesses that noticed the crime and noticed that it was clearly a hate crime done against this young African-American male. However, there was no justice done. And basically the suspects were not apprehended. And finally, when there was enough outcry that the subjects were apprehended 2 to 3 weeks, after the murder was occurred, the superintendent of the police claimed that he didn't know that you could make an arrest based on reasonable suspicion. And then he later dropped the complete case due to insufficient evidence. This lawyer, Sir William McPherson, who later became knighted, at that time just William McPherson, took on this case after public outcry and the family's outcry, and won the case based off of a concept that he coined institutional racism. It's later now systemic racism against the entire police department in that section of London, where he claimed that basically it was so permeated the culture that due justice did not take place. So what we're looking at here is both an individual level of how race permeates, and also in a more kind of implicit level on a more large scale or macro scale. And how does this kind of cause a disparity in healthcare? So the first thing that we're going to look at for that is how poverty, none of the problems that occur in health are unique to health. These are problems that are also permeating in other parts of society, but also are unique to health in the case of how they affect the health of the individual. But we'll get into that. One of the biggest things that affects health is poverty. And there was a study done by the Health Services Research in 1998, which is partially funded by Medicare. And it quotes, "The collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their ethnic or origin was determined to be the most salient determinant of utilization of healthcare services is insurance status, regardless of race or ethnicity, rural or urban place of residence. racial and ethnic minorities were less likely than whites to use physician services, and use was generally lower for rural residents, directly correlated to insurance status. So we know insurance, so right there you get a big correlative factor right out of the gate. Poverty, and this is not anything more than common sense, poverty will lead to less healthcare. Why? Because if you don't have insurance, you're more likely not to go in to see the doctor. You're going to be worried. You don't know if you're going to be able to pay for it. You're not going to do preventative care. And as a general rule, the whole behavior of going into the doctor is going to be less because the people around you are going to go less to the physician. That will lead down the line to reduced healthcare and reduced preventative care and things down the line that way. It goes a little further than that, though. There is this problem is more multifactorial, as we see, and to get you to appreciate kind of how this goes a little deeper, let's go one layer deeper in terms of poverty. And this is a study done by the Journal of, I'm going to quote a few studies, scientific studies, as I go through along. If anyone has any questions about it or wants more information, I have the information both in front of me, and I can also send them to anyone who wants. So this is a study done by the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics, and it's by Ayer et al. In 2011. And this is looking at the poverty on brain development. Kind of more recently, it's become kind of in vogue to look, because with the advent of MRI and functional MRI, so ability to look at tissue and see how tissue results change. And this is really kind of a hot subject in terms of neuroplasticity and how brain changes by looking at brain MRIs. And so this group, Ayer et al., looked at the detrimental effects of growing up in poverty on brain development and related academic outcomes in kids, in children. So using data from the National Institutes of Health magnetic resonance imaging study on normal brain development, they looked at children that were living 1.5 times below the federal poverty level, and I'll go into that in a minute, had smaller volumes of brain regions critical for cognitive and academic performance. This is gray matter in the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. Okay? While smaller brain volumes in children reared in poverty have been demonstrated previously, the correlation with poor academic and cognitive outcomes in children living in poverty have been well known for several decades. Ayer et al. Went to elucidate the mechanism of the relationship, finding that poor cognitive and academic performance among children living in poverty was mediated by a smaller hippocampus and frontal and temporal lobes that were decreased by as much as 15 to 20% in these children. Given the nature of the study sample investigated, where children facing numerous other risk factors, given poor brain development, and were screened out for this, it is generally accepted and likely that the effects reported represent an underestimation of the magnitude of the general risk in the population. So their 15 to 20% less brain development in the impoverished kids, they determined was most likely an underestimate. The percentage in the US below poverty is directly correlated to race. And this is, again, not something that I think most people would find very shocking. But according to the US Census and the Kaiser Foundation in 2018, the percentage in the US below the poverty limit, where the poverty limit is 2 parents and 1 child making $20,212 or less, was less than 1 in 10 or 9% in Caucasian, and 22% or 1 in 5 families amongst Africans. So we have a direct correlation of greater than 2 times as much in an ethnic minority such as African that are poor. We have a direct correlation of poverty causing problems with access to healthcare and insurance, and also even to the level of brain development. Even before they even get to see the doctor, problems are occurring. So I'm going to tell you a couple of quick stories that kind of just not bring all facts and studies in there. When I grew up, for those of you that, so I teach, so part of my thing, I teach surgery at Georgetown to residents. I'm on the faculty staff at Georgetown, and I'm in private practice, but I didn't grow up in DC. I grew up in a town called Cumberland, Maryland, which is about 3.5 hours west of DC. And it's a relatively rural area in the Appalachian kind of mountain area of Maryland bordering West Virginia. It is a economically depressed area. I didn't feel it very much. My parents were well off. My father was a physician. But one of the memories that struck me very deeply growing up that I still remember and will share with you is when I was in the 6th grade. When I was in the 6th grade, I joined a choir in Cumberland, and I enjoyed it. And the choir kind of exposed me. There were other kids in there that I got to meet. And one of the kids that became a friend of mine was this kid, Robbie. And I won't say his last name, obviously. Robbie, we became friends through choir and got to see him every day. And, maybe a couple months into it or so, he invited me over to have a sleepover at his house. Now, until then, I had friends in my neighborhood that I would go to sleepovers with and do things like that with. But I'd never interacted too much with other kids that weren't in my neighborhood or that I hadn't already been friends with. To this level of friendship that I would go for a sleepover. And I remember going to his house. It was a Thursday night. I remember the Friday was a half day. And so I went to his house. He had rented a video game system. We went to his place. And that day I remember distinctly that sleepover because it was the first time I ever had macaroni and cheese. And I was fascinated by macaroni. I loved it. And I remember thinking I'd seen so many commercials for macaroni and cheese, but I'd never tried it. And his mom actually made macaroni and cheese for me and him and his sister, Robbie's sister. And I remember I wanted to get, she made one box for all of us, and I was tarofing in Persian culture, whatever. I couldn't go ask for more, but I was definitely wanted some more. And I looked around to see if anyone else is going to say anything. Didn't have any more, so I was like, okay, I'll just get it next time I go home. So that night I went to sleep, woke up the next morning, and Robbie said, "Do you want to get breakfast?" And I said, yeah. And so he gave me a ticket and said, we'll get it at school. I go to school and I go with Robbie to the cafeteria. And we give the ticket and they give us breakfast. Now, I have been going to school, with these same kids. I grew up in Cumberland. I was there before school, so pre-K up through. So I've been with these kids. I know most of them. When I went to the cafeteria, I noticed that about a little less than half, 40% of the kids were having breakfast there. I never even knew the school served breakfast. I thought these kids were just we would just join them in homeroom. And so I was shocked. I didn't know there was breakfast here. And we ate the breakfast. Breakfast is not very good. Lunch isn't very good, but it's school lunch and school breakfast, but we had it. And I remember kind of being able to realize what happened, but I didn't fully process it. I couldn't fully process it. And I went to my 6th grade science teacher who I knew well, Mr. Stimmel, who I was close with. After class, I asked him what was going on. Why were these why were they having breakfast in school, and why were the tickets are being involved, and no one's, and he said those are the kids, the government provides them food because they don't have enough to eat. So the government gives them those tickets, and then they can have breakfast, so they have a meal along with lunch. Well, I was completely in a haze, I would say, for the rest of the day. I couldn't believe it. These are my friends. These are people that I've been interacting with every day. And in the United States, in the town that I live in, when we go to the grocery stores, it's packed with food. I couldn't understand, how is it possible that 40% of these kids are getting tickets just to be able to eat breakfast and lunch. I remember talking, I was so upset and kind of bewildered. I remember I had difficulty like facing my own dad with it, right? Because for me, my dad was like this person of honor, a person that I looked up to. And I thought, how could he let something like this go? Knowing, like, we're sitting here, I'm picking different cereals I want for breakfast, knowing all around this is going on. He must have known that this is going on. How could this happen? This doesn't make any sense. We're not in Ethiopia. I thought maybe this goes on, maybe in some foreign place. And I knew that there are different wealth stratifications, but I didn't think that it would, that I thought, okay, maybe everyone doesn't have a big house, but not having enough to eat was disturbing. Eventually my dad noticed that I was kind of ignoring him, and he sat down and talked to me, and we talked through it, and he gave me a series of answers that were satisfactory, and we moved on. But that highlights kind of where we are. These things are not something that are kind of an abstract situation. They are something that is not thousands of miles away. Cumberland is about 180 miles from DC, and I guarantee you don't have to go that far to see this. You can go within miles of where we are. There are, at this very time, people that are not having the basic necessities. And we'll kind of go into how this can happen and all that in terms of how we allow these things to go down in terms of the treatments and things. So getting back to things, another one of the components in poverty in terms of health disparity is incarceration. So a prison. Poverty in individuals in the family is one of the big problems in lower income is the possibility of incarceration, but especially among certain ethnic minorities, especially African and Latino. African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate that is 5.1 times the imprisonments of whites. And Hispanics are greater than 3 to 1. How does that play into health? Well, in a number of ways. First of all, when someone in the family member, especially the male, is incarcerated, the household income drops precipitously. And we all know, again, going back to poverty, that poverty affects health. So that is a correlation. But also when they did, for example, things such as HIV, virus, one of the reasons that HIV virus is more prevalent in African Americans is that it is much higher in people that have been incarcerated through drug use, through rape, things like this. So that, let's take, for example, a male in a household gets arrested. They go to jail. In jail, they acquire HIV. Well, they come back to their family, they can give it to their wife, who then can transmit that down to the child. And now your prevalence goes up because you're in a community now. Your cousin, your family, your friends all live in that community. Well, someone else is going to marry someone more likely in that community. Now they're going to get a higher likelihood of getting HIV. So you can see how the virus will spread more in this community over time. That's a health disparity. So that's one of the things. One of the other things that is very clear is, so we've looked at incarceration, we looked at poverty. This is all kind of correlated with poverty, is the communities in which there is lower health care, there's not as much investment in that community. There's an interesting study that looked, and this is in China, this is not even in the United States, but this study looked in China that looked at the equity in the distribution of CT and MRI machines, a panel analysis by Chen et al. In 2001. And this is in the International Journal of Equity in Health. And what it found was that MRI machines distribution correlated directly to community wealth due to market forces. So you're more likely to have access to more advanced healthcare when you live in an area where the people can pay out of pocket for this healthcare. And that's across the board. Less so in communities and Scandinavian communities that have a more systemic healthcare plan, but still even in those, to a certain extent they are, even in Canada and other socialist kind of setups. So taking this another step further to kind of go through more, I'll give you another example. I said I teach cataract surgery at Georgetown. So my main role at Georgetown in teaching is, in fact, laser surgery and intraocular surgery, anterior segment surgery for residents in the 2nd and 3rd year of their residency. That's what I do. So I do cases with students and give them feedback and all that. Let me stop there. Does anyone have any questions before I go on? Everything is okay? Because there's not that feedback as much, given that it's Zoom. Is everything good? Does anyone have anything to add?
Dr. Moanie, continue. We are going to have a question and answer coming up.
Perfect. Okay, I'll continue. And Dr. Bachelard, please let me know if I'm running late or too much. I have about 20 minutes more. So going back to what I do, the distribution of ethnicity in DC is about 45-55. 45% is actually pretty high African community directly in the city I'm talking about. So 45% African American, 55% Caucasian. Okay. So I do the way that we do surgery, the way that you learn surgery in the United States, for those that know and don't know, and it's actually surprising. A lot of people don't know how actually do people learn how to do surgery on people. Is there'll be an attending that has done a number of them, like myself or some of my colleagues that are the teachers. And then there's the residents. And at first they watch a whole bunch of surgeries and then slowly they do them. There is no virtual reality so far that is effective, at least in eye surgery. We actually had a couple of machines, but they didn't work very well. The students were better than the best attendings, the best teachers that do it after about a days because they could play video games better. So the virtual reality machines were taken away. So far, they don't work. So the way that they learn then is they observe for a while, and then we start doing cases on people. Well, let's look at this. Why would anyone want to go to have a doctor train with them and do surgery with them? Well, and this is part of the thing that makes it, another topic. Well, this is a difficult topic, but sometimes we have to be honest about how things go. These people are giving a big sacrifice to do that. There's a lot of people that say, oh yes, that there's multi-tiered things that show that academic institutions have better healthcare. That is true. There's a lot of checks and balances, but when you look at the complication rate for surgeries, it is higher, much higher in teaching institutions when the case is a teaching case. So that distinction should be made. There are a lot of, Georgetown is a teaching university. However, a lot of the cases, in fact, most of the cases aren't teaching cases. The residents aren't doing a lot of it. A lot of them are the attendings doing the cases. When you are doing the teaching case, of course, there's going to be more complications. These are people that have done maybe 10 surgeries, 20 surgeries, compared to someone that's done 1,000. surgeries, right? But we're with them, we're doing the surgery. So we try to mitigate those risks as much as possible, but you still have some of those risks, okay? I've done, just myself, probably about 700, 800 cases, both as a resident and now and teaching. And like I said, it's 45, 55, right? 45%, 55%. We do surgeries for a lot of people that don't have health insurance. We do surgeries for people that don't have the resources, and we provide a financial incentive for them to come and to give a little bit of sacrifice in order for us for the resident to learn to do the surgery. And if anything goes wrong, the attending, such as myself, will step in and do their best. But with that, there's still a little higher complication. To put it in perspective, out of those 700 cases, the amount of Caucasians I've done, maybe 15, right? So we have almost a 50-50 distribution of population. And I have done, of those cases, and I can tell you in the clinic, you would not know that we live in a place that has Caucasians when you come into the eye clinic at Washington Hospital Center, Georgia. In fact, I would argue it would be almost impossible, because almost all of the patients there are indeed African American. So they're having when I go to get a surgery, if I was going to get an eye surgery, or a lot of the people, let's say you live in, I don't know, an area in Georgetown or whatever. A lot of people, if given the choice, they're going to want to go see someone that's done many cases. It's common sense. But there is a disparity there, right? They don't have access to be able to do that. So they have to undergo an additional risk, right? Now, this raises a couple of issues that we can always get. In the end, we need a standardized system that is fair for everyone. And it is true that there is going to be, it's very difficult to achieve a utopian state. No one is saying that, you know, it would be nice if everyone got the best surgeon in the world to do every surgery. That's not the case. But it doesn't take that much to see that there is a significant inequity in risk being taken. And so that's another aspect that kind of brings into this equation. Going in further, and this kind of goes one layer even deeper, is that even when you take out financial factors in terms of health, there is still a disparity. And what is this? There was a study done by Harris et al. In 1997, and this is a very interesting study that accounted for, the title of this thing was the title for the study, was Racial and Gender Differences in the Use of Procedures for Black and White Hospitalized Adults. And what it found was that in these 1.7 million people that they looked at a cohort study retrospectively, they found, after accounting for the similar insurance levels, they found a 20 to 26% less diagnostic and therapeutic intervention amongst minorities, especially Latino and African. So now, even if they have the same amount of insurance, they're still getting less, 1/5 less. How can that be? Well, I kind of hinted to a little bit in my own thing when I was telling you about the 2020 cataract surgery and how often I did the ultrasound. So one of the follow-up studies to that was a Medicare funded study that showed, and this study was done in 2005, and it was called Understanding and Addressing Racial Disparities in Healthcare. And they said that in real life medical encounters, and this is a quote, the automatic activation of stereotypes may provide the negative characterizations that triggers unconscious biases for to account for treatment disparities. So let me just go down here. So they're basically saying that there is an implicit bias on top of the poverty. So we talked about poverty and all the things that go along with that, incarceration, things like that. We talked about how the environment that you are, the MRI machines in China, we talked about that. The access to healthcare from being poor and going to be segmented to receive care from perhaps physicians or people in care that are not quite as qualified. We talked about that. Now we're talking about stereotyping, implicit bias. And let me show you how deep this goes. And this is a psychological study done by Steele and Aronson in 1995, a Stanford study. This is purely psychology, but a very interesting study, and some of you may know it, that showed something called the stereotype threat. And what this showed was that an experiment involving African-American and white college students who took a difficult test, the verbal GRE, under 2 different conditions, okay? And in the stereotype threat condition, students were told that their performance on the test would be a good indicator of their underlying intellectual abilities. In the non-threat condition, they were told that the test was simply a problem-solving exercise and was not diagnostic of their ability. Performance was compared in the 2 conditions, and the results showed that African-American participants performed less than their white counterparts in the stereotype threat condition, but not in the non-threat condition. Their performance equaled their potential. In both of the studies, the threat, when they told the person that this test is measuring your ability, the ability of the person was less than what they thought it was. So in essence, there is racism amongst their own self. That's how deep the level goes. That's what this is showing. That's what the stereotype threat is showing. You're not able to perform to your own ability because of a preconceived notion that's been built in that you are less somehow. Now, so we've talked about all this. Now what do we do about it, right? Let's get to the treatment. So we're seeing kind of the level of problems that this does. Poverty, implicit bias, stereotyping, geographic maldistribution of resources. And then we're not even getting into, I'm going to skip it for time reasons, but trust in the medical procedures and all those kind of things. Let's get into treatment a little bit now. What can we do about this? Let's get to the crux of it. We know some of the things that people have tried. And one of them is education, right? So in medical schools, they teach, for example, nursing and medical schools, they teach racial disparity awareness. Okay, does it make a difference? No one knows yet. The studies are still out. I looked at a bunch of studies to try to see, is the education of health care providers actually lead to a difference in terms of not having a racial bias toward your patients, and in the end, a significant difference in terms of the racial disparity of healthcare. We don't know. One of the things they did find, though, is a study by Williams and Rucker, also out of Stanford, in a study Understanding Racial Disparities in Healthcare. They found that most legislation, interventional programs, and policies regarding discrimination have been ineffective because of their purpose on purposeful or intentional discrimination, whereas the problem lies more in implicit and institutional racism. So we're getting back to the permeated racism that comes from being in a system where there's poverty, in a system where there's implicit bias. So one of the things that is very well known is affirmative action, right? Affirmative action is having a quota for minorities to be in healthcare. The thought process there is, and what they've shown is that successful recruitment of minorities in medical schools increases when affirmative action is taken place. And that was a 1999 study. And collectively, diversity in medical education provides enhanced access to healthcare for underserved populations, because minority physicians are more likely than their non-minority colleagues to practice in underserved and minority areas. So that's a good thing. However, that has to be tempered with a study done by McKellen et al. In 1999 that showed Black physicians have only increased on average 2.5% from 1968 to 1999. Only 2.5%. And that's about 30 years, even with the affirmative action and everything that's been placed there. And the reason for that is a lot of schools have gone back and forth with affirmative action. There are studies that showed that matching physician race with client race is not enough to curb any significant disparity. So there are some studies that kind of argue against affirmative action. So maybe it will work. So their education, legislation, these sorts of things have some role, but it is increasingly clear in the research that it's not solving the problem. So what do we do? Where is this leading? Well, it's leading to why we're all here tonight, kind of, which is, you can't, maybe the answer isn't in just providing more and more rules, more and more legislation. Maybe the problem is deeper. I have a patient that's a diabetic patient that I've been following for about 8 years, and he has multiple physicians at this point: a neurologist, a nephrologist, I'm his ophthalmologist, he has his primary care doctor, a rheumatologist. And whenever I see him, I see like another doctor is being added on. And when I talk to him, I tell him, you can keep adding all these doctors on as an ophthalmologist looking for diabetic retinopathy and all these things. The neurologist is looking for peripheral neuropathy or damage to the nerves because of too much sugar. The kidney doctor is looking for damage to the kidneys from clearing out too much glucose. But the problems all stem from the source, right? Which in his case is diabetes. Rumi, I like a quote by Rumi for this, and the quote says, "Maybe you are searching among branches for what only appears in the roots." So we can keep talking about what different tort reform we can do amongst laws. We can talk about how we engage in affirmative action in a more fundamental level. But in the end, we need to address the bigger issue if we want real progress. And I'd like to give a quote by Shoghi Effendi. And this is from The Advent of Divine Justice. And he says, in regards to blacks and whites in America, and this is where the quote begins, "Let neither think that the solution of so vast a problem is a matter that exclusively concerns the other," so black or white. "Let neither think that such a problem can either easily or immediately be resolved. Let neither think that anything short of genuine love, extreme patience, true humility, consummate tact, sound initiative, mature wisdom, and deliberate, persistent, and prayerful effort can succeed in blotting out the stain which this patent evil has left on the fair name of their common country." This is page 40 from The Advent of Divine Justice. So what we're getting at here is that the true solution to this is not an easy fix. It's not, some things will help, rules will help. It has to be a change of a heart, and that heart is something that is based in spirituality. So I'd like to say a final story, kind of going back to kind of bringing it all around, and then love to open it up for questions. When I was in medical school, my mom called me up one day and told me that there is a kid that said he went to high school with me, that had called to, wanted to talk to me. And I said, okay, who was it? And my mom said, it's this kid named Derek, and he said he really wants to talk to you, Nima. And I told him that you're at school and that you're not going to be back. And he said if he could give your number. And I remembered Derek. I remembered this kid. And I remembered I told my mom, I was like, yeah, give me his number, but do not give your information of where you live. And don't let him in the house if he says he wants to come over. Derek was a kid. Cumberland was a great place to live growing up. But it's very homogeneous. It's not like here. And there were a few bad apples, and Derek was one of them. And he would sometimes cross the line and say things that weren't very good to me. And I remember in football practice, he would intentionally, try to hit me harder and hurt me and bully me to a certain extent. I had forgotten all about him, to be honest with you, by the time it wasn't very severe, but it was definitely there. Now, Derek, I lost touch with him. I didn't really interact with him much after 11th grade, after I stopped playing football. That was really where I would interact with him the most. Thankfully, I didn't see him very much after that. Derek got married, and he moved to an area about 10, 12 miles away from Cumberland, in a town in West Virginia. He was happy there, I guess, and all that. And a number of years went by, and he had a daughter named Jocelyn. Jocelyn was born premature, and the hospital in that area in West Virginia did not have adequate care for a premature baby of that prematurity level. Apparently, from what he told me, the baby had, a lot of times when babies are born premature, they don't have enough surfactant, which is a chemical that is released in the alveoli to breathe, becomes a problem, and then you can get end organ damage and damage from oxygenation, all these kind of things. Derek and his wife did not have good financial resources. They did not have insurance. While they were looking to find a place to send the baby, the condition of Jocelyn was deteriorating. One of the doctors at the hospital knew that there was a doctor around that they could consult, a neonatologist nearby that had helped before, and they decided to give that doctor a call. So they called that doctor up. That doctor came in, helped treated Jocelyn. In fact, stayed the night, and then the next morning left and went back to work. Jocelyn's condition had stabilized by then, and Jocelyn grew up very well. Derek met the physician the next day and thanked him, obviously, for helping out in that, and realized that physician was my dad. My dad was a neonatologist, and he'd gone up there. So Derek, years later, like a year later or so, had called up, and he wanted to talk to me. He wanted to apologize to me when I spoke with him. I did talk to him. I called him up. And he said he felt bad for bullying me, and he wanted to thank me and thank my dad and all that for the care that my dad did. And he said the reason that he was very both appreciative and very apologetic for his action, basically. And he's an adult now, right? So he realized what he was doing in early high school and all that was not appropriate and all this kind of stuff. He said the reason that he was bullying or negative toward me was that his dad told him that all these foreigners had come in to Cumberland and had taken all the good jobs and been wealthy, and that is a reason why they're poor. One of the reasons that they're poor. And he realized that that's not the case, right? So, and what was realized is that just because you're wealthy doesn't mean that you're bad. Just in the same way that just because you're poor doesn't mean that you're lazy or not smart. They're mutually exclusive conditions. And what Derek told me was that he said that he wanted me to know that he has taught his daughter differently, right? So we understand that. I'm going to get into the ripple effect of this a little bit. I'd like to give you a quote from Baha'u'llah here in a hidden word. And the hidden word says, know ye not why we created you all from the same dust? ? That no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your heart how you were created. Since we have created you all from the same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land. That from your innermost being, by your deeds and actions, the sign of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest. So 2 more points and then I'm done. So we see that this is a slow process, okay? But I have some good news, because if you look at it, if you look at just humankind's progression, about 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, we would have spent a lot of our resources would be spent protecting ourselves. Let's say you live in Bethesda. A lot of our resources and our time and energy would be spent protecting ourselves from an invasion from Silver Spring. About 1,200, we're talking about the Dark Ages, right? We'd be concerned about another tribe 10, 20 miles over coming in, raiding us, killing us, enslaving the people. It sounds ridiculous right now, right? It is absolutely absurd. Silver Spring coming to attack Bethesda? We don't care about that stuff. And that was just 1,200 years ago, right? The human brain hasn't changed that much, right? The evolution of the human brain hasn't changed that much. What accounts for the difference? Well, humankind is progressing, right? So progress is a slow but very but can happen, and it happens in quantum. So let's end it with the ripple effect of this Jocelyn girl, right? So this girl, Derek's daughter, she got care from somebody who came in who helped her out, right? Jocelyn's and Derek and his wife will have a better financial future because they don't have to deal with the health problems that Jocelyn would have had. If she would have left another day or two, she would have had end organ damage. She would have had a lifetime of medical bills, would not have had the ability to thrive as much, and would put her in a financial burden. But let's say, and she became healthy. Let's say Jocelyn, because of this health, but also because of the increase in the financial situation and all these kind of factors going together, Jocelyn will do better in her life. Maybe Jocelyn becomes a doctor, right, in the future. And when Jocelyn is a doctor in the future, she will then get another patient. Let's say a little Hispanic kid, right? When she goes to do the health care for that Hispanic kid, and it comes time for them to do a CT scan, her likelihood of ordering a CT scan is going to be higher, not because of affirmative action, but because her dad taught her that basically we're all equal. Her dad taught her essentially what Martin Luther King was saying, which is judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. So she is in turn going to help that Hispanic kid maybe get a CT that is going to help them, which increases the health care for them, which will increase more further and further and further. And that's how the ripple effect goes, right? So I'm very optimistic. I think that, probably not in the so distant future, the issue of racial disparity in healthcare will be as antiquated and as barbaric as the thought of someone in Silver Spring coming to raid someone in Bethesda. But it's going to be a matter of effort, it's going to be a matter of faith, and it's going to be a matter of patience. That's it.
Wow. Dr. Moanie, we have some speakers, they talk more in our head, about our head. Some speakers, they talk more to our heart, but you really mastered both of them. You spoke both for our heart and for our brain. And this is really to be congratulated. I'm not going to say very much more. I'm going to give it to, excuse me, Miss Dara, because there are lots of questions. I know, and the people, they wanted to comment. Dara, please.
Yeah, so I'm looking now. So thank you for your excellent talk and from your storytelling and really how you wove everything together, the research and the reality. So friends, where are your questions? All right, I'm seeing that from Gary. Thank you. Excellent presentation. Satya, excellent presentation. All right, while people are thinking about questions, I have one for you.
Yes.
A couple questions. One is, and I honor your optimism about things changing, and I think this awareness, but I am curious around bias, unconscious bias. And, you know, how do you see that playing out in medicine still, and maybe what the antidote is for that?
Right. So the unconscious bias, that is a problem. That is the source of the issue, right? And that's something that has to be ingrained over time. Just like it's human nature to have stereotypes. There's, to a certain extent, there's nothing wrong with stereotypes. That's how we interact with our environment. It's how we interact with how we defend ourselves from certain problems. We learn things or certain ways. But we have to realize that in order for there to be a change, right, that bias, that implicit bias, has to be taken out from a fundamental level as in childhood. It has to be in the environment so that we don't even get the same way that we build the negative stereotype. We also build the positive stereotype, right? One of the things I think that is key for all of this is the notion of interdependence. So like, for example, one of the things I do when there's a surgery that goes, you know, I have these students for 2 to 3 years, right? And sometimes the surgery goes bad for no fault. A surgery will go bad, or a surgery will go really good for the student, right? And it's very difficult when it goes bad. The student feels horrible. Every surgery resident, or all of us actually have this situation where things go bad. When I'm in the operating room, one of the things that I do that actually was taught by someone is I will, at the end of the case, let's go the other way. Let's say surgeries are going very well, and I think that the student is starting to get a little cocky, trying to talk about how I can speed up my time on surgery, or talking about how good their outcomes are and stuff like that. What I'll do at the end of the case, the nurses are all leaving and going. I'll ask that student if they wouldn't mind going to turn the light switch off. You know, it's just me and the student in the operating room. They call it the theater lights off of the British surgical system, the theater. They'll go and turn the light off, and I tell them to come back. It's pretty dark in the room. And I ask the student, do you think you can do the surgery now? And they'll say, no, you know, I can't do it. No, why can't you do it? It's dark. I'm like, okay. Do you know how that light switch works? And they may say, oh, what do you mean? What are you talking about? I was like, how does the light switch work? I said, well, you turn it on, the electricity. I was like, but do you really understand it? Do you understand like Kirchhoff's rules of circuitry? I'm like, no. I'm like, okay. So there was an electrician behind turning that light switch on, right? And they say, yes. Not only was there an electrician, that light switch was built off of information done by so many people: Kirchhoff, Ohm, right? Benjamin Franklin understanding electricity, Thomas Edison, DC versus AC currents. You can go on and on and on. Even the electrician's parents who made that person be honorable and do the circuitry correctly, so to code so that you can turn the light switch on and off for you to do the surgery. Now, I'm not even getting into the actual surgery yet. We haven't even gotten to that. We're just talking about the light switch just to turn the lights on in order to do the surgery. You want to get into blood type. The blood that we gave to the patient is blood typing. Someone found that out. Louis Pasteur, the antibiotics we give to make the surgery successful, the engineering involved in all this stuff, all these kind of things. So when we look at it, we are such a small part to play in that surgery that if you take credit, by taking credit for doing the surgery and, oh, I saved this person's sight, is such a naive statement, right? think of all the thousands of people that came to make that moment possible, from the electrician to do the light switch, all the way up through the fundamentals of cataract surgery or whatever surgery you're doing. We are such a small part in that. So when I see, like right now with coronavirus, they keep talking about we're all in this together. Well, the truth of the matter is we've always been in everything together. We are completely interdependent upon each other. And in everything that we do, right? In the house that you're standing in the built to cook, all these kind of things are built upon generations and generations of knowledge that are passed from humans to humans. That's our biggest gift, that we're able to progress. And that is fundamental to biases as well, is that is a huge part of it, is that we cannot discount the effect that our environment, that our parents, that our teachers, and all these play in shaping our future. And those fundamentals are shaped through things like religion and through spirituality, which is a core of humanity. So that's kind of where the
Thank you for your thoughtful response. All right, Jamar has a question. Is it possible that stereotype threat in test takers, test takers raised anxiety levels rather than a disbelief in self?
Yes, so that's a great question. So that is true. And there is so if you take the two populations in that study, which was African American and Caucasian Americans, right? That anxiety level will cause both to drop a little bit, right? However, what they found was that the African American drop was higher than or I should say lower, so the drop was greater than the Caucasian drop. So that level where it could be attributed to anxiety, that increase in anxiety that's more so than the Caucasian, is attributed to the fundamental difference between the two, which is the race. That's what they were getting at.
Thank you. All right, Satya says, what do you think is a good intervention for parents to ensure they raise their children in she says in this way, but non-biased, non-prejudiced, non-racist way?
Mm-hmm. So it's hard, right? I think I don't think I'm qualified. I'm not a parent yet, but I can say from the things that I've seen, I think the first example is to be an example yourself. So much of what children learn from their parents, I think, comes from what the standard is that the parent has placed, and from the actions of the parent themselves. If you want your kid to be non-biased, you first have to be non-biased yourself, right? Because the biggest environment that influences the child is in the home. And in fact, this kind of ties in a little bit to the discussion that I actually had with my dad, that same situation. I told you guys that story about Robbie, my friend from Chorus, that turned out that didn't have that much to eat. When I was talking about it with my dad, I was asking him, how could this be like this? And he told me, he gave me a few answers. And one of them was, humankind is a progress. You're right. First of all, he didn't discount the problem. He said, you're right, there is disparities. You're right that you should be upset that your friends and all that don't have food, and you're right that maybe I could do more, right? But one of the things that he said was that the role of a parent, what he told me, he said it in Farsi, so I'm paraphrasing it, but he said the role of a parent is to teach what's right and wrong to the kid, and also to give the wisdom that they've learned through their life so that their kids are better, right? But one of the roles for you as a child is to both recognize the qualities in your parents that are good, and also try to learn from their shortcomings to improve those as well, right? So it's a two-way street. Your parents are going to do what's right, but as a kid, you also can learn from the shortcomings in your parents as well.
Thank
And
you.
if they've done a good job, yeah, that's it.
Okay, my kids probably have learned a lot from my shortcomings. Good to know. And the last question from Keegan. What changes have you seen in the healthcare industry in regards to ending prejudice?
That's a great question. Changes I've seen. I'll be honest, a little bit of it is frustrating on certain levels. I think that the biggest change that I've seen is an increased awareness, right? The brushing under the table of the discrepancies is not there anymore. When I'm interacting with other physicians and things like that, it is something that is much more commonly brought up, even before this latest social thing, even talking about a year ago or 2 years ago. It is much more commonly brought up in the younger population of doctors than it was in some of the older population. Is something that the awareness has increased. And that is a positive sign. In my own actual practice, haven't seen maybe it's too short term still, but I haven't seen too much of a difference yet. But to be honest, to be 100% honest, but the awareness is there more and the intent is there more. And I think that the actions follow intent. So things are, like we said, progress does take a little bit of time. Not to say we shouldn't go as quickly as possible, but they can take time.
Thank you. Thank you for your helpfulness, sharing your experience and your wisdom. Any other questions? I see Ziba going like this. Ziba, did I miss any questions? Unmute yourself. I can't read your lips. Unmute.
No, I said I forgot I was on camera. I'm just writing.
Okay. Did you want to say anything?
Yes, I just want to say I love you, Dr. Nima.
Thank you. I love you too.
So thank you again. Thank you, dear friends, for joining us. And I know we have many doctors on our Zoom tonight, and just encourage you to continue to uplift the injustices and the prejudices and the racism. And especially please keep in mind women of color. And helping to stand for justice and make sure that they're okay. I have a young friend who is actually a young woman of color who's in med school at Georgetown, and the stories that she shares with me. So I'm just asking as an ally, please help. So thank you. And on that, Rebecca, I pass the talking piece to you for our closing prayer.
She's going to say a prayer now, Rebecca.
Okay. Oh, my Lord, make thy beauty to be my food, and thy presence my drink, and thy pleasure my hope, and praise of thee my action, and remembrance of thee my companion, and the power of thy sovereignty my succor, and thy habitation my home, and my dwelling place, the seat thou hast sanctified from the limitations imposed upon them, who are shut out as by a veil from thee. Thou art verily the Almighty, the All-Glorious, the most powerful. Baha'u'llah.
I have to tell you, thank you, friends, for making this really possible for us, really. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. B, for your long commitment to these Firesides on Friday, and everybody else. So you know what time it is. Unmute yourself, and it's time for tea and dessert.